The dark powers of cursed objects. True tales from around the world. Today we dive into the world of cursed objects. Strange but true stories of some of the most infamous items known to history. Drawing from the pages of Cursed Objects, Strange but True Stories of the World's Most Infamous Items, we'll explore artifacts that have left a trail of destruction and misfortune in their wake. Author J.W. Oker will talk about these cursed items lurking in museums, graveyards, and even private homes. Their bizarre and often tragic stories have inspired countless of horror films, novels, campfire legends, and in this episode, we'll uncover the chilling tales of objects like Annabelle the Doll and the unlucky mummy, said to have sunk the Titanic, even sparked World War I. Well, if you're fascinated by the eerie connection between history and the supernatural, like I am, then this episode is for you. So, I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. Please welcome to the Truth Be Told studios for the first time, J.W. Oker. JW.
Hey, Tony, thanks for the invite.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. This is the last week of September 2024. So next week is going to be the Halloween season. I mean, we're kind of already touching on it now because, you know, truth be told, we love it anyway. So we're like the Walmart. We put up the Christmas lights in July. So
No, me too. I'm staring outside my window right now at one of those giant skeletons. So I'm ready to go.
So I'm excited to have you here because we are going to be talking, about your book, Cursed Objects, Strange but True Stories of the World's Most Infamous Items. And I always say when I talk to people about UFOs or Bigfoot or, ghost, there's always a story that kind of led us down that road to highlight our podcast or the campfire stories. So I'm kind of curious how you got started real quick before we go into the book. How you got started and what inspired you to be in this genre of paranormal.
It's a good question. I was always going to be a writer. It's always kind of what I wanted to be. And I went through this phase of my life where I wasn't writing, but I wasn't doing anything. And I've always had like a dark streak, right? It's always kind of been there. The way I explain it is, I can't explain why I like the color green. I just like the color green. Same with like an old cemetery or the shape of a skull is really appealing to me for some reason, always is. So there's that. But then I started, really, when I started my publishing career, looking for weird stuff, like traveling, the country and the world, looking for the weirdest, I call them oddities, that I could find, visit, and photograph. And turns out most weird stuff is macabre, right? Mm-hmm. And all macabre is death-related. And most of the paranormal is just death-related, right? Ghosts, not so much cryptids and Bigfoot, but like ghosts and, cursed objects, there's a lot of that in there. So that's kind of how it happened. I just had a tendency toward it. And then when I was trying to find unique stuff, the death stuff was always the most unique. Putting a body part on display at a museum is going to, it's way more interesting than putting a book on display at a museum.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, and we've always talked about, on the opposite side, lucky rabbit's foot, which I never understood how that could be a lucky because the rabbit lost it just so we could be lucky. I never got that. But so just in your experience, where did you start? What object that, growing up, maybe that you heard about was unlucky? I mean, of course, glass breaking, that's an object that, gave you bad luck. But what are some of the objects that you were aware of even growing up as a kid?
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up like hyper religious, so I didn't have like luck and fortune and bad luck. It wasn't a thing, right? It's like a lot more like conscious than that, right? Whatever's happening to you.
Right.
But I grew up I live in New England right now, or I have for a very long time, but I grew up in Maryland, right outside of DC. And DC is home to the most infamous / famous cursed object of all, the Hope Diamond, right? Mm-hmm. So I grew up going to the Smithsonian. Smithsonian's free. You don't have to pay to get in there.
Right.
The country's treasures are in there. Going in there and seeing this one little, this tiny little diamond sparkling. I think back in the day it was in the wall, but these days it's on like a rotating pedestal in the middle of the room because it's like the most visited object in the entire Smithsonian collection. And it's to me, it's like the iconic cursed object because it has a long history, right? That is documented. So it's not some random thing on the internet, right? A documented history of where it went, whatever, who got affected by it, and it's like just the perfect cursed object, right? It's small enough to lose. It's expensive enough that like only the very wealthy had it in their hands, right? So they're very interesting people that had it in their hands, and then it ends up, in our nation's attic, right? It ends up in the Smithsonian. So that's always been knowing that I had such access to like the most famous cursed object in the world, or at least in the country, is always fascinated me. Always kind of pulled me toward that.
No, it is fascinating. In fact, you should write a book on the most cursed family names, because like Kennedys and certain, how people, that would be an interesting book. But the curses that, I've heard this many times, I feel cursed, oh, my life, everything goes wrong, I feel cursed. But what do you think in your research of finding what object is usually seems to be the one that's cursed the most? We've heard about the diamond, but that's one. But what have you heard probably the most?
I got two answers to that. One is gemstones. For some reason, there's probably 13 or 14 very famous cursed gemstones. 13 out of 14 of them, of which are on public display, by the way. Only one of it's in private hands. So that's one of them. And again, I think it's for the reasons I already mentioned. Like, it's in the world of the rich, and it's small, and it's always torn out of an eye of an idol, right? They all have that origin story. But the other one, which is, it seems relatively recent because of Annabelle, but it's always dolls. Like if you go to eBay right now and search cursed objects, because they sell cursed objects on eBay, it'll be doll after doll after doll after doll after doll. So, and I think the reasons for those are pretty apparent too. Like, dolls have a creepy side. They're little homunculus. I never say that word. Little versions of people, and they have faces that look at you. And the old ones are really terrifying, and they're supposed to be for children, and yet they aren't. They don't seem like they should be for children. And so for some reason we ascribe those as cursed. Although I always tell people, like, those aren't the dangerous cursed objects. If it is cursed, that doll or that whatever $10 billion gemstone, you're gonna be fine, right? The stuff you have to worry about is the mundane stuff that's cursed, right? If your kitchen table is cursed, you'll never guess it. You'll never guess your kitchen table is the thing bringing all the bad luck into your life, because it's such a mundane item. But anything can be cursed. So those are the dangerous ones.
I mean, there was a few tables in my home that I stubbed my toe on many times. So maybe I just didn't know it was cursed. But I do have a couple of friends that are psychics, and they both have haunted dolls. They call them haunted, but cursed is very similar, I'm sure. And I do see how dolls can be creepy by just looking at them. Even though if they're smiling, it's that constant no emotion, even through a smile. It's all about the way they look, and I could see where people can take it as creepy.
And they're always staring. They're just always staring because they're not real eyes, but they just feel like they're always looking at you. And like if a human did that to you, somebody sat in your living room just stared at you, you'd be extremely uncomfortable. And it's kind of the same feeling. This thing just won't. Even though it's not supposed to blink or look away, it's a doll. It still feels like a human being is staring at you.
Well, don't they say like many like serial killers and sociopaths that they don't blink a lot? So I think that might be very similar to a doll where they don't blink. So it's unless you get those that you can tilt upside down and they.
Right.
But in your research, did you find a common characteristic though among cursed objects that link to the misfortune of people, and if so, what makes an object cursed in your opinion? I mean, I'm sure many objects have their reason, but what is your opinion?
Yeah, the first thing I had to do before I even really started the project was define what a cursed object was. Because it's actually pretty complicated, right? You mentioned like haunted dolls, right? Haunted and cursed are two different things in the paranormal world. One is something is inhabited by a presence. The other thing is just cursed naturally, but they both can act like cursed objects if they bring misfortune, right? So first of all, I'd say, okay, they have to bring misfortune. My next rule is like, but they have to bring misfortune to multiple people, not lots, but multiple people, right? Otherwise, how do you know it's the object bringing that misfortune?
Right.
And then the third one, it had to be supernatural, right? Or psychological, one of the two, because a gun is an object that can hurt a lot of people, right?
Right.
But the mechanism of that is pretty well understood. So it had to be like, it had to be an object that brought misfortune of varying kinds to multiple people through supernatural or through unknown means, put it that way. Because again, the scariest thing to me, like, it's easy to like pshaw ghosts and Bigfoot, but cursed objects there's actually some scientific validation for the concept of cursed objects that there isn't in the rest of the paranormal world yet or at all. And that's like really terrifying. Science is like, maybe they're real. They're like, we can make them cursed in our minds.
Well, that's interesting that you said haunted and cursed are two different things. Because most people would probably put those two as one. So
it's funny. So one of the ways I mentioned. So if you go online, right, and this is also one of the reasons I wrote the book. You'll see listicles of cursed objects. Top 10 cursed objects. It's always the same 10, and then it's always that the Myrtle Plantation mirror is one. That's a good example. But the thing about the Myrtle Plantation mirror is that it never harms anybody. Like, you see no stories, or you see maybe figures in it or handprints on it. Right. But it doesn't actually harm somebody. So that's not really cursed. It could be haunted, I guess, but it's not cursed. So there is a definite line. But again, at the end of the day, if that possessed thing is hurting multiple people, that it might as well be cursed.
Right. And that goes back to because we've heard stories for thousands of years about folklore and about cursed objects or cursed locations, but in the many items that you have stories on that in your book, how did you separate the fact and the folklore? Because I always say, couldn't you imagine your dad and you go fishing, and where I'm from, it's not fishing, it's fishing, and you catch a 2-pound bass. And 3 or 4 years from now, it's like, that was the biggest 10-pound bass I have ever seen in my life. So that fish grew by 8 pounds. So I'm kind of curious in 1,000 years or 500, even 100 years, how do you break the fact and the folklore into?
It's a good question. And with cursed objects, it's actually easier than, or like famous cursed objects. Again, I focus on the famous ones. That's easier than, say, a haunted house, like breaking down that lore, because it's also vague. But with cursed objects, again, and you mentioned this in your intro, I would say of the ones that still exist. So some of the cursed objects in this book they're lost to time.
Right.
But of the ones that exist, I would say 80% of them are in museums. So that means they have a provenance. That means we have a history of them. We know exactly where they were.
Right.
So again, not to harp on the Poor Hope Diamond, but like, we know all the people that, like Evelyn Walsh, who was one of the last owners of the Hope Diamond. She's the one that wore it in like a crown on her head, put it on her dog, and also like try to hawk it to like help fund the search for the Lindbergh baby. She had a lot of documented misfortune in her life, a lot, insanity and suicides and deaths. So that part was kind of easy. When it was less documentable, I would always mention it, but always have to context it by saying, no proof here, or if there was like anti-proof, like you mentioned the Mummy Board, it is touted as being the one that sunk the Titanic and the Lusitania, I think, and also started World War II. Like, it couldn't have been in those places. It just couldn't. But again, you do want to mention those stories because they are wrapped around that piece and they do infuse something. But for those objects, it's kind of lucky for me. There's so many true stories about these objects that I didn't, most of them anyway, I didn't have to like load it with too many lore and legend, right? So a lot of times in paranormal books, I don't know if you run across this, but a lot of them, they're no documentation really. Like, if one person posted on a chat board about something, bam, right in the book, right? So with cursed objects, there was a lot of documentation, so it wasn't as hard. But again, I didn't want to throw out something just because it had no documentation or it was just a rumor. For some of these items, they're like hundreds of years old, so like a rumor that lasts 200 years is almost a fact.
Right.
It's lived long enough to be relevant, right? So it's not just, again, me finding a cursed object in my friend's house and then listening to his story and putting it in the book. It's literally like, me finding the ice mummy, Otzi, right? And be like, oh, that his entire life, or death, I should say, post life, has been pretty well documented and studied. So I can use those.
So let's ask you this. We've made the determination haunted and cursed. So with many of these cursed objects, you say 80% of them are probably in museums around the world. So how how do these curators of these museums, how do they believe in these curses, or if they do and or don't, how do they protect people around to not bring on that curse? I mean, I would think it would make me nervous if I knew everybody that pretty much was in, that owned it or around it has been harmed or suffered losses. So how does one, like you said?
Yeah, and what you just said, that was a good nuance where you said not just owned it, but been around it, because cursed objects don't just hurt the owner. Sometimes it hurts the journalist writing about them. Sometimes it hurts the guy taking a photo of it or the guy passing it.
Right.
I think most curators, and when I say they're in museums, I mean they're in the top museums in the world, right? They're they're the Smithsonian's, they're in the British Museum, they're in New York, they're in big museums. So generally, curators don't believe, but they do love the stories. The stories help bring people in, right? It helps pique people's curiosity and bring it in. However, there's a whole subset of museums, more private collection museums, right, that do collect. They just collect haunted objects, right? Zaff's museum, the Newkirk Museum, like even the Warrens Museum there when they were around. What they would say is they would have a ritual for cleansing it, right? I think Zaffis goes on the record the most about this, where he says he uses crystals and prayers and sunlight and ocean water, whatever, salt. And then he says if it doesn't work, he just gets rid of it. It's his story. So there's a ritual to it for those that actually focus on haunted objects or cursed objects. They have their rituals, but for those that don't, those who are like more mainstream curators of the world's treasures, they don't do much. Again, you can get within everybody on this planet can get within 3 inches of the Hope Diamond right now.
That would kind of freak me out. Even though I it's not that I don't believe in curses. It's just I don't. I go into a situation where I feel like I protect myself. So maybe that keeps me from, bringing home many curses. But before we go into, because I want to go into like some of the objects that you have in your book, and I want to talk about those. But, hauntings, we could bring in a psychic and say, ghost, go to the light, be gone, you're not welcome here. How do you break a curse? Because if it's thousands of years old, somebody's had to say at one time, like, I don't want this anymore. Go away. Leave me alone. How do you feel how to break a curse versus a
there's two ways. Two ways. The first is you give it to somebody else.
Right.
That's the very first
yours.
way. That's right. It's the ring, right? You just give the VHS to somebody else. That's one way. A little shady, but that's one way.
Right.
The other way is simply, and this is where some of the science comes in, is don't believe in it. The science has this idea of a placebo, right? Where the body can heal itself on zero provocation. And the body can heal itself even knowing it's a placebo. Like, this blows my mind that you can say, this is a sugar pill, it's going to help you, and it can help you. Like, science hasn't figured it out, but it knows it works. We have the opposite idea as well, the nocebo, which is something will harm you if you tell you it's going to harm you, right? That's why one of the most famous ones of that is zombieism, right? Where like people do go listless and lose their appetites and wander when they told they're a zombie, because they've kind of convinced themselves they're a zombie. And with cursed objects, if you believe it's cursed, and again, we don't know that there's science behind this. We don't totally understand it, but you can start bringing really bad luck and misfortune to your life. So again, that's the two ways. Either give it to somebody else if you really believe, and two, if you can not believe, it just becomes an object again, because its power over you is kind of determined by you.
Maybe that's why I go into it's not that I don't believe, I don't believe it can harm me in some way. So, and I have to say, they tell you all the time, you look in the mirror and go, you're fat, ugly, and dumb every day. You're going to start feeling fat, ugly, and dumb.
Exactly right.
So I can get that. So, well, let's go into some of the objects and topics that you have in your book. So, of course, we have Annabelle, which is from the Conjuring franchise, the house. And so, have you got to see many of these objects like Annabelle? And then I want to talk about your opinion on Annabelle and what your research.
Yeah, so I saw, because I always turn my nonfiction into travelogue nonfiction.
Oh, that's good.
Because again, most of the value in the book for me is the experience, the people I meet, the things I see, the places I go. Like, the book is like a cherry. Like, I love writing it, but like really looking back on my career, the real value is the experience. So in this book, I went to see most of them. Again, a lot of them are not around anymore. Some are too far for me to go to. But I saw most of them and continue to see them, honestly, if I get the opportunity to see them. And it's so and also I went so far as to buy one, right? Because one of the sections is the business of cursed objects, where they sell cursed objects. So I bought one. So again, just have the experience and put that in the book. So yeah, and I've seen Annabelle. They back in the day, you could only see it when the Warrens were alive. You could only see it, at special occasions in their house in Connecticut, right? But since their death, they put that thing on tour almost. Like every year at the Paracon, which is usually in Connecticut, I think this year's in Pennsylvania. They have a good chunk of the Warrens collection on display, and Annabelle is the main attraction. She's there in that box they have, the "Do Not Touch" sign on it, right? The famous one. And yeah, so these days, again, it's almost like the Hope Diamond. If you just time the conference right, everybody can get within a few feet of Annabelle.
Well, I have to say, Annabelle is a freaky looking doll. I mean,
I know, especially to people who are younger who don't know who Raggedy Ann is, right?
Oh yeah, Raggedy Ann was kind of weird looking.
Design, yeah, the design is if you're not used to it, it is a very freaky design.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the next one. I just so we did talk about this for a second, the unlucky mummy. Well, yes. I mean, you look at it and you're like, hey, that's actually pretty colors and great design, and doesn't look to be threatening. Where did this come from? What was one of the first accounts of the cursed folklore or stories from this one?
So this is a good one. I like it a lot because it's literally just the top of a sarcophagus. There's no mummy in it. It's literally, that's why it's a mummy board. It's shaped like a human, like you just saw in the image, but like it's just a board. It's on display right now at the British Museum. You can go see it anytime you want. And the reason why it's special is it predates the King Tut curse story, right? So it kind of set the template for Egyptian curses. Before the mummy board, we didn't have this classic, you loot a pyramid, you take a body, and you get cursed. The mummy board really started that, and then King Tut blew it into the skyline, right? It made it a thing. The mummy board is your typical story, right? At some point in time, at that time, I think it was the 19th century, so 18th, 19th century, so it was always the British people. The British were like, looting tombs, but they were like buying artifacts, right? That had been looted from graves, especially in Egypt, which has a massively material funeralistic culture. At least ancient Egypt did. There's tons of artifacts buried in the sands and inside of tombs and pyramids, and looters would take it and then they would sell it to people who were willing to buy it. In this case, it was bought by a group of Englishmen, who then, various ones they started having problems. I think one, shot himself on accident during a hunting event. Another one died, and it ended up in a private collection in England. So it did go over there. It said that when they brought it over, the photographer who was taking pictures of it, he died. So there's a lot of stories of people just interacting with this board and dying. The main guy that kept it at the end, the guy that survived of the group, he was in like a paranormal society, some kind of ghost telling story society, and like he would tell stories of this thing all the time. And then eventually those stories got bigger and bigger. And again, Britain for a time there was the center of the world, of the world landscape. So anything big happened that had any connection to Europe or to England, this mummy board got blamed for it. World War II, the assassination attempt was because the mummy board was in that guy's possessions, right? Because it'd gone to private collectors for a while. It was on the Titanic, and that's why the Titanic sunk. It was on, I think, the Lusitania or something in North America. It sunk as well, and somehow it kept coming back. Somehow it kept getting salvaged and passed around. That story is bogus. Those stories are bogus, right? Because obviously a mummy board didn't cause World War II, but also it just couldn't be in all these places. It just wasn't. It's most of its time after the original group had it at the British Museum. But all the stories of the main group are true, and of course, it just has a long history as an ancient artifact. So I like this one a lot because again, it feels like the mummy inside the sarcophagus would be the cursed thing, right? The dead body, but it's the board, the beautifully carved board. And it's just sitting, again, if you walk through the Egyptian wing of the British Museum, which I have, there's tons of cool stuff. You would never, ever, 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 ever notice this one. Like, it's just a board. They have actual mummies all around that are cooler and full sarcophagi. And they have a bunch of mummy boards and urns and all kinds of things. And you're going to walk right by this because there's so many things like that and cooler than that. Honestly, you'd have no idea that this thing, has had a curse story wrapped around it for centuries. And also, it set the template for cursed Egyptian funerary artifacts.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't think too many people probably have heard the unlucky mummy, but I find they're all fascinating. How so many objects that can be cursed, and I'm curious. Do you believe a lot of these cursed objects, such as the unlucky mummy, holds like more of a supernatural power, or merely just like tragic coincidences, versus, like I said, just more of like a supernatural power? Because I get for the Egypt where, these looters come in and steal all these, their final resting place, and get a little pissed off, and the gods above are like, no, we're not gonna have this. But yeah. What is your take? It's
easy. You have to fall on coincidence, right? Because the one thing that all cursed objects share in common is they don't hurt everybody. Like, they're very selective, almost, to the point, right? They're not weapons of mass destruction at all, right? It's particular people here and there every once in a while through different means, owners, journalists, and it almost seems random. Like, again, Otzi the Ice Mummy, hundreds of people have touched that thing, and thousands of people have seen it, tens of thousands maybe, and only like its death count is maybe 15, which is pretty high for a cursed object, but still, of the people who should be cursed by it, it's not. But the thing is, especially with these items, because they're famous, because they've been around for hundreds and thousands of years, they're going to be around death. Like death.
Right.
I always tell people, again, in the search for the macabre, I live in New England, and I love New England because there's so much macabre stuff up here. It's because it's the part of the country's been around the longest. And time plus human beings equals lots of death. And if an object's been around long enough, it's been around death. I think usually because a lot of rich people have these artifacts, their deaths are more interesting usually because, there's, rich people are weird. And so, like, their stories are more interesting than, like, again, somebody with a cursed ottoman in their living room. They're not going to have as interesting a story. But the rich people will have interesting stories because they're doing all kinds of places. They're weird. They're going cool places. They're buying weird stuff. So I think that's it. It's just they're around long enough that enough people have died around them.
And you said you have purchased one. So the question is throughout history, cursed objects have been feared, but also collected. And why do you think people, or drives people to own something like this, and that it in some people's mind considered dangerous and deadly?
It's interesting. Again, it's kind of a oxymoron almost,
right?
A real life oxymoron that it's dangerous. I'm going to collect it all,
right?
I try to to me that's a big negative mark against the idea of cursed objects if people can collect them. However, the way I have got around that in my mind, rationalized it, is zoos are full of deadly animals. Again, I grew up in DC. The National Zoo is amazing, but it's full of tigers and lions and bears and venomous serpents.
Oh my!
But those people, yeah, exactly, nice. But those people, they're run by professionals who know how to handle those things, right?
Right.
The difference is in parapsychology, there's not a ton of degrees and internships you're doing. You're kind of just self-proclaimed. So, but that's kind of how I see it. If somebody knows how to deal with it, but I do see the appeal to say I own cursed objects. Again, I'm perverse enough and macabre enough that having a cursed object appeals to me. Just on that level of strange, weird morbidness, and it's very morbid instinct, right? It's the same as people that like to collect, human skulls or even animal taxidermy, right? There's a morbidness to that. That is appealing to certain people, and I think cursed objects fit that. Same people like me who would, put a statue of, I have a taxidermy bat in my basement, and I like it. I'm that kind of guy who would also be like, oh, this is cursed, I'll take it. But again, for good or ill, honestly,
right.
doesn't always pay off for sure.
Well, it's like next week because truth be told, and it's under the umbrella of Club Paranormal. And then I have a nonprofit called Earthly Beings, and we're putting on events that are kind of based around ancient cultures and ancient traditions and ancient religions, bringing it into the modern world so we can kind of just see where we came from. And next week we are having a psychic medium doing a live event for Halloween, more entertainment than really educational.
Sure.
And I was at a Starbucks up in where I live, and I said, hey, you should come to the event. And she's like, oh, I want to, but I'm Catholic, and it scares me, and it feels like it goes against my religion, and da 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 da. But you said you were brought up very religious.
Mm-hmm.
How did that kind of go against, your thoughts and even your family? How did they feel about having an object that would be considered cursed in your house?
Yeah. No, it's funny because that Catholic person and myself back in the day, I'm not religious anymore. We believe more than paranormal people. And like again, the world I grew up in, the air is full of demons and angels.
Yeah, very paranormal.
Witches are real. And the reason why your Catholic friend wouldn't go is because she fully believed in it, right? That's why. And it was the wrong kind of forces for her religion. So I always joke I don't believe in anything these days. I don't anything from ghosts to true love. I don't believe in. Back in the day, I believed in everything,
right?
Like everything. A religious person believes in again, we all believe in extravagant things,
mm-hmm.
whether it's again a supernatural being or it's like I believe nobody's gonna kill me when I get in my car. Like that's all faith. But that belief is real. So these days, the whatever I am, I don't even know, nihilist cynic guy, I still had to answer those questions of like, okay, I'm gonna buy this thing. I don't believe in curses. I mean, I know the science says it a little bit, which is a little bit terrifying. But what if I'm wrong?
Yeah,
I've been wrong a lot of times in my life, and what if I'm wrong this time? It seems like need to take, and I still did it because I just needed a book gimmick. It's just what I just needed something for the book.
Yeah.
And so I bought one, and nothing happened. It was a good year. I I put on it was a little bronze bulldog. I put it on my desk. I took it on vacation with us. Nothing happened. But then whatever, like 2 years later, my entire life fell apart. Like everything in my life fell apart from like floor to ceiling. Wow. And now I have to wonder the rest of my life, did it just fall apart because lives fall apart, or did that stupid bulldog have a tiny bit to do with it? I always have to wonder this now. I hate it. I used to do these talks. I'd be like, cursed objects. And I bought this bulldog and I bring it with me to the talk. And I'm like, look, and I had a great time with it. It was great. It was like, and my joke was always, you get a new pet, like especially a dog.
Right.
The dog doesn't act like itself for a while, right? It's kind of timid and hides in corners, but eventually it becomes its full self. And so the joke was always, well, maybe this cursed object will one day become its full self. And now I can't do that bit anymore in my talks because of all like the misfortune I did eventually suffer in my life. I'm just like, oh man, I lost the punchline. Now it's like I could turn it into a real curse story, I guess.
So in that case, what did you do? What person that you didn't like give it? Did you give it to?
It's still there. It's sitting in it's almost like pointless. Like my life so collapsed on itself that there was nothing left to like break. So like it's still there. It's still there. It's still like that would be the next experiment, right? I should get rid of that and see what happens. Like, does my life suddenly do a massive U-turn? Does
win the lottery or something?
Yeah. And that's right. Does it start finally happening for me? That's what I should do. But you're right. Who would I give that to? I have a few ideas already.
All right, we'll talk off air about that. I mean, but actually, though, you think about it. Even you've heard somebody that wins the lottery, the lottery curse. All these people win the lottery, their life. Even though they had millions of dollars, they've lost their family, they lost their friends, they then eventually lost all their money. So I mean, I guess in some ways you can lose in many different areas when they consider it a curse.
Yeah, they always say it's almost impossible to tell a blessing from a curse until you have like long enough time.
Right?
It's just hard to know.
Right now. Going, researching around the world, maybe even going to seeing some of these objects, was there ever an object that because I feel like I'm very intuitive where, if you're around somebody and instantly you're like, I just don't feel comfortable, or I just don't like this person. It just, they didn't even have to do much. You just like, I just don't care for them. Is there an object that you have been around that you were uneasy and even were like, I don't think I can stick around very long? And which one was it, if you did?
Well, here's the irony on that one. So I have this section in the book where I pick up objects that should be cursed. In my experience, like, why aren't these cursed? And I write about those as well. And one of those objects is the mummified or the preserved head of the Dusseldorf vampire. Do you know about this?
Tell me.
So the Dusseldorf vampire was a serial killer in Germany. Killed a lot of people, would drink their blood, but his body count's pretty high, and he would destroy women. He was an evil dude. So they eventually caught him, executed him, And then, because they wanted to like study his brain, they kind of preserved his head and like, you know, looked at his brain. That's him. That's it. And for some reason, I mean, there's a chain of provenance. It ended up, that severed head that split in half because they dissected it in a Ripley's Believe It or Not museum in Wisconsin, in the Wisconsin Dells, literally right there with like Lego sculptures and family family tickets and stuff. And you go into it and it's on this hook and it's slowly rotating and it's lit so that you can see, it's well preserved. It's like you can see the hairs on his cheeks still and like everything like that. I think his cranial cavity is empty. I can't remember or not, but I think it's empty. But it was so disturbing. Obviously, it's a disturbing artifact intrinsically, right?
Right.
But I'm like, why hasn't this cursed everybody who's owned it? Like the severed head of a serial killer seems like something again, and this is the way about most body parts, I guess, most preserved body parts. It feels like if desecration starts a curse, if evil deeds start a curse, if people being evil from the ground up starts a curse, this thing has all those elements to it. But it's not a cursed object. But again, I did feel super strange around it. I mean, not so strange I didn't go see it and show my kids, but like it felt very weird.
I can see why. In fact, I'm going to show that picture again, just because that's one of those doll faces where it just looks like no emotion. It's just like you can even see in the eyes. It's just kind of like, eh.
Yeah. Yep. And it looks very German too.
Very German. So what have you heard? And I'm sure you've talked to a lot of experts of going into or purchasing or going into a museum or even somebody's home to protect yourself. How have you heard from other people, and how do you protect yourself going into something like this? And
well, they would say the number one thing is not to go in, right? That's classic caution is just don't.
Kind of like saying having safe sex. Don't, if you don't want to get pregnant, have safe sex.
Right. The safest sex is not sex. That's right.
Yeah.
So there's that, but again, it's really, again, a lot of times they hold on to their beliefs, right? I know the Warrens have their issues, right? But they at least had a aesthetic around what their methodology was. It was based in Christianity, a lot of crosses, that kind of thing. So to this day, a lot of people still kind of like ascribe to your own positive religion, the positive aspects of your religion to fight. Because again, if you believe cursed objects are evil, like somebody either imbued it or it's evil with purpose, then you got to use good with purpose to kind of combat it, right? And that is prayers, and that is iconography, and that is believing in higher powers. If you believe that it can happen just naturally, it's like this natural phenomenon that like a thing just gathers bad mojo like a battery. There's not a lot you can do. Again, you can try to just not believe it, but if it is, it's almost like whatever. If there's a hot stove, there's just no way you can believe yourself into not getting hurt by that stove. I know some people claim they can do that, right?
Right.
Like cold walkers and stuff, but there's methodologies behind that. But normal people, if the stove is hot, there's just no way you can say you can believe yourself or hope to Christ that like it won't burn you if you touch it. It's just going to burn you. So I think in some ways, sometimes there's no way to protect yourself. But the same with anything, right? Same with any like a weapon, same with a dangerous animal. Sometimes there's just no way to protect yourself.
Do you feel like a lot of these objects are, I mean, like I would say not the Hope Diamond, but are more religious based curses? Because it seems like a lot of things could be,
That's a really good question. I would say no. And I've never thought about it this way. Most of the objects are not religion based at all. They're very mundane, or they're from jewels to furniture to
that's crazy.
Funerary objects, statues. I mean, the closest thing to a cursed object religious wise, I think in the book, is probably the Dybbuk Box, which again is a giant hoax and actually is not religious, but that is probably the closest thing to a religious artifact if you believe the story, right? But most of the time it is literally just based on basic human stuff, right? Again, looting a tomb or desecrating a grave, or stealing something that sometimes causes a curse. Or a lot of gems were supposed to be stolen.
Right.
So it's a bad act that actually does it. It's not necessarily a blasphemous act or any kind of like religious sacrilege or desecration. It's usually just bad acts. That's interesting. I don't know what that means. Right. I never thought about it until you said that. But that is kind of interesting that religion very rarely plays a part in the origin story. Sometimes in the anti-story, like we talked about.
Yeah, that's
but never in the origin story.
That's pretty interesting. So, All right. Well, unfortunately, we're about to wrap up, but I want to see if you could give us a takeaway for our listeners that are, to maybe that people are looking for answers with your book. Is there anything that you should kind of give people some advice on, what to do, how to, if they want to go research a cursed object, or what can you give a takeaway for, your readers and our listeners today?
Yeah, first I would actually say to find the beauty in cursed objects. I did fall in love with cursed objects as a result. I mean, I've always kind of been interested in them, but falling in love with them because what they are really, like literally what they are, is objects that we use to wrap stories around. So again, going back to the whole diamond, Evelyn Walsh is somebody nobody would know in history, really,
right.
Unless you're like deep in the DC social history of socialites. But because of this one object, it's very easy to learn who Evelyn Walsh was. So it's a way to remember stories, right? Mostly tragedies, almost 100% it's a way to remember tragic stories, but it gives us this opportunity to tell the story. So I would say, look for the stories. A lot of times, go to the museums. Again, most of the stuff is in museums. They're amazing. And then, research beyond like the YouTube top 10 list, because these things are in the newspapers, in the magazines, in historical documentation from museums. But again, learn to fall in love with them, and you'll fear them less, but also you kind of see the value of them, like holding on to these stories for us.
I wonder if you walked into a museum such as like the Natural History or Smithsonian, if you did ask a curator or somebody that worked there and says, can you tell me the items that are cursed in your museum, if they would be like crazy, or like, oh yeah, that one over there has been, I'm curious to see if they would actually be open to.
I think in my experiences, they're more likely to take you to something and tell you a story.
That's cool. That would be cool.
Yeah.
So, well, JW, thank you so much. And I know people can go to oddthingsiveseen.com and check out, how many books have you written?
My 11th came out last week, so I think it's about 60% nonfiction, like cursed objects, and the other half are novels.
And so, what was this latest one?
It's a book about cults. So again, going back to religion, I wrote a book kind of similar to cursed objects, where I picked 30 of the most interesting cults that I could find for various reasons, and I told their story in this book.
Well, you're going to have to come back and talk about that, because I find cults so fascinating. Yeah, because I'm like, there's no way I would ever fall for a cult, but, never say never. But
I can surprise you with some ideas. I learned so much, not just about cults individually, but like the mentality and ideas, and as a result of that project, I'll come back for sure.
I definitely want to do that. So, but please, everybody go out and pick up, for the Halloween season. Come on, that'd be a great stocking stuffer for your Halloween fireplace. Cursed Objects, please go pick it up on Amazon. Go on his website, oddthingsiveseen.com. Are you going to be speaking at any Paracons or any places around the country soon?
Yeah, the next 2 months, or I guess almost October now. The next month I have a lot of appearances. So if you go to my website, oddthingsiveseen.com, go to the appearances tab. It'll tell you all the states I'm doing a talk or showing up or doing a signing.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I had a good time. I hope you did too.
Yeah, me too. That was great.
All right, everybody. So thank you guys for joining us today. I really appreciate you. And, make sure you subscribe, share, and follow our YouTube channel. And please tell your friends. Don't forget, if you're around next Friday, we have the Halloween Psychic Experience with Colby Rebel up in Newhall, California, up in Santa Clarita, where Magic Mountain is. If you're local, and get your tickets, limited seating. It's selling out fast, and it's going to be a great time. So, but please, every Friday, live right here. I'm excited to have you part of the show. We'd like to hear it from you on what you want on the channel, and all kinds of different stories that maybe we can have a day that you guys can tell us your stories. But until next time, I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. I will see you very soon. Take care, guys.